Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, the show about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne. This time, we're going to start by learning more about one of our League allies by looking at the descriptions of their attire. Attire of dissection. Attire of the Madaras twins, residents of the Forbidden Woods, likely that of the older brother. The twins are hunters together, and they dissect beasts, bring them back, and are said to have offered them up to the villagers' forbidden research. And while that description is the same on the gloves and the trousers, the headpiece features some more information. Mask of dissection. Mask of the Madaras twins, residents of the Forbidden Woods, likely that of the older brother. The twins did not even communicate through words, and were raised together with a poisonous snake. As they grew older, they learned humanness and became hunters. They discovered a bug in their beloved poisonous snake, and the younger brother is said to have killed the older. Between this guy and Walter the Beast Eater, I'm starting to feel uneasy about my fellow League members. But it's not the rumor of fratricide that interests me as a translator. Instead, I'm struck by how the localization team chose to deal with the challenge of naming this set of items, because the Japanese term that defines this attire doesn't really have an equivalent in English. So to better understand the problem, let's get a sense for what's going on in the original. In Japanese, the main word used to describe this set is fuwake, which literally consists of the kanji for viscera, followed by a form of the term for divide up. This gives it a strong association with the process of dissection, which also ties into its historical usage. My Daijisen Japanese dictionary simply lists fuwake as a synonym for kaibo, which it defines as the word for cutting into a body to observe its internal workings and/or determine the cause of an illness or death. I've also found an encyclopedia entry which specifically notes that fuwake and kaitai are older terms for kaibo. Furthermore, while the definition I've provided so far largely sounds like it would apply to the practice either of a dissection or an autopsy, the modern term kaibo is also the word used in Japanese to refer to the science of anatomy. So, depending on which aspect of the definition is being emphasized, this attire could be literally understood as belonging to an anatomist, a pathologist who performs autopsies, or a dissector of some kind. Ideally, though, the title chosen should be a less formal or archaic one, as opposed to something clinical that we would recognize today. That is a wide spread of meanings and specific cultural information to convey, but fortunately we have some additional context from the item description that can help us narrow things down. The relevant information here is that the Madaras twins were cutting up beasts and bringing back the body parts to be used in the taboo research of villagers in the Forbidden Woods. This lets us rule out the sense of an autopsy and makes the idea of anatomical study seem less likely as well, since it's the body parts of the beasts that the twins bring back, meaning they're not looking for a cause of death or closely studying the beast's biological compositions. Instead, the emphasis seems to fall on the process of dissection itself. This is why I chose that specific term for my more literal translation, but what about that idea of an older or more colloquial version of the term also implied by the Japanese? Well, this is why I think the official translation has made the leap to the term butcher. After all, it's a word that's used to refer to people who cut up flesh and separate out the organs of beasts, and it's much less formal than either dissector or dissection. Beyond that, the term has an association with crudeness that fits with what you'd expect from the denizens of the Forbidden Woods. In other words, it's a translation that fits the setting this attire is associated with, and that does a good job conveying many of the specific nuances of the term fuwake. However, that's not to say there are no trade-offs being made here. An English-speaking player picking up the butcher set isn't going to have as strong an association with the act of dissection as a Japanese-speaking one. Also, for all the comparative crudeness of the research being done by the people who live in the Forbidden Woods, it could still be valid. While these trade-offs are real, though, they aren't the whole story, because as we've seen before, the official translators have included more information by using a different translation for the same Japanese word elsewhere. In the shared description of the leg, hand, and chest piece for this set, fuwake appears as a verb, and in this instance, the official translation speaks of dissecting beast prey. So if you put all this information together, you wind up with the idea that the person who wore this set was a hunter who doubled as a butcher by dissecting beasts killed on the hunt to further the experiments of the people of the Forbidden Woods. This is all the most relevant information contained in the Japanese, and while the term butcher does put a different, less clinical spin on the profession in question, it also reflects the more colloquial aspect of the Japanese term. Plus, it's true to the crude nature of the settlements we find in the Forbidden Woods and the history of the Madaras twins themselves, who seem to have been raised by snakes until they later learned human ways. On the whole, then, I think the translators have done a good job making the best of a tricky linguistic situation. Speaking of tricky situations, though, we seem to have stumbled across the aftermath of one here in the game. That arrow suggests Simon recently put Ludwig out of his misery, so let's see what he has to say about it.
Oh. He's well and truly gone now. A tragic figure. But he will shame himself no longer. He died with his ideals untarnished. He was a true hero, and earned that much at least. Here, this is Ludwig's guiding light, the blinding thread that led and misled that consummate hero, the poor brute.
Hey, if you don't want it, I'll take it. Anything else on your mind?
Do you know why the hunters are drawn to this nightmare? Because it sprouted from their very misdeeds. Things that some would rather keep secret. A pitiful tale of petty arrogance, really. High time someone exposed the whole charade.
Yeah, you're very insistent about that.
Now, go on ahead. You seek nightmares and the secrets within, do you not?
Actually, at the moment, I'm thinking of picking up some weapon variants. While I do that, though, there's a particular line from the first of Simon's dialogues that I want to discuss. You may have noticed that the English line where Simon calls Ludwig a poor brute is one that I treated very differently in my more literal interpretation, instead having Simon announce, "I say, no thanks." Despite the apparently stark difference in meaning, though, I think I can see the reasoning behind this creative choice, so I want to explore the many layers of linguistic and creative interpretation that may have gone into it. Let's begin with the linguistics. In this case, unlike with the term fuwake in the butcher set, all of the words involved are normal and part of everyday speech. The key term, gomen, is one that even people starting to learn Japanese tend to be familiar with as a way to say, "I'm sorry." But this is where I think the need for more interpretation comes in. Because while the word gomen is often used to apologize, it actually has a wider set of meanings. Most of these alternative uses are either specific to certain situations or too formal for this line of dialogue. But there is one other sense that I think is applicable, where the speaker indicates their dislike of or wish to avoid something. For instance, the example sentence, "Senso wa nidoto gomen da," would translate to something like, "I never want to experience war again." Understood in this sense, Simon would be closing his speech on the Holy Moonlight Sword and its deceptiveness by expressing his lack of desire for either the sword, the deceit, or both. This makes more sense to me in the immediate context than an apology, even if he is standing over Ludwig's corpse after having clearly shot him with an arrow. I also think the casual tone created by the final particle ne doesn't fit well with an apology, and I'd be inclined to interpret this phrase as some kind of statement of distaste even without the surrounding context. As confident as I am in that interpretation, though, it still leaves an important question unanswered. What exactly is it that Simon is saying he doesn't want? As I mentioned before, he could be talking about the sword itself. After all, not only is this the last thing he says after calling our attention to the blade, it's also the line that directly precedes the on-screen prompt for the player receiving the item. By this understanding, the line could simply be rendered, "I don't want it," and it would fit pretty well. However, it's also worth considering that Simon might be saying he doesn't want to be deceived. After all, the preceding line includes the idea that the sword led and misled Ludwig, and it would be entirely within Simon's character to say that he prefers an ugly truth to a beautiful lie. Remember, we first catch his interest by expressing a fascination with the nightmare, despite its potential to bring us grief. Also, after we take the sword, his very next lines are an exhortation to us to expose the shameful secrets hidden within the hunter's nightmare. So maybe Simon is saying that Ludwig's fate is one that he wouldn't want to share. These two possibilities mean that in translating this line, you have to make a choice. Either write it so that it supports the interpretation that Simon is rejecting the sword, word it so it's more in line with Simon saying he doesn't want to end up like Ludwig, or find some neutral expression that could go either way in English. That last approach is the one I've adopted in my literal translation, though it would obviously sound clunky as part of the in-game dialogue. Personally, in this case, I don't think I'd take that trade-off. I would say it's better to pick one of the two competing interpretations rather than come up with a non-committal line that doesn't come across as natural in ordinary speech. This seems to be the translation team's preference as well, and judging by the way they wound up writing the line, I think they went with the more thematic interpretation of Simon not wanting to share Ludwig's fate. After all, one way to show Simon's distaste for Ludwig being misled by the Holy Moonlight Sword would be to denigrate him for succumbing to such madness. It also fits with the somewhat conflicted attitude that Simon seems to have for Ludwig. Note how Simon calls the old hunter a tragic figure, a true hero, and even a consummate hero before finally labeling him a poor brute. Just from this language, it seems plain that Simon respected Ludwig for what he was in his heyday, but found his descent into beasthood shameful. Add to that the timing of Simon's killing Ludwig, after the latter had regained some of his senses, and Simon's line about Ludwig dying with his ideals untarnished, and it seems like Simon was motivated to do what he did, at least in part, by a sense of honor and mercy. So having Simon call Ludwig a poor brute to underscore that mixture of respect for what Ludwig was and disdain for what he became seems fitting to me, and I would argue it still serves the function of expressing Simon's distaste for Ludwig's ultimate fate. It may not be the obvious choice for a translation, and wouldn't make sense in isolation, but that's what I think makes the translator's approach so interesting. If my understanding of the logic behind the decision is correct, they would have needed to dig into the core idea not only of the words that Simon speaks, but of his specific role in Bloodborne to come up with a line that helps further its themes as a creative work. It's a style of translation I have a lot of respect for, which is why I've gone on about this one short line at such length. But now that I've gone to the trouble of picking up those weapon variants, I think it's time we looked at the description for one. Lost Beast Flesh Cutter. A device-installed weapon used by the old hunters. The thick iron knife, made to cut through even the tough hide of beasts, has its blades separate by means of a device, and can also be swung like a heavy whip. It would be difficult to call this brutish weapon, which relies purely on strength, refined. Therefore, the hunts of the old hunters were gruesome, and their forms were soaked in reddish-black blood. If you're not already familiar, the thing that identifies this as a variant weapon is the addition of the word lost to its name. The regular version is just called the Beast Cutter, and there's another variant in English known as the Uncanny Beast Cutter. As you can see, all three of these items share an identical description. It's a fairly straightforward naming convention, especially in English, but there are a few quirks to it, particularly in Japanese, that I think it's worth exploring in detail as opposed to looking closer at the fairly straightforward description of the beast cutter itself. That's because, as simple as they are, these alternate weapon names are meant to contribute to our understanding of Bloodborne's story, and the Japanese naming convention actually supports this a little bit better than the English one does. What makes the weapons significant in the first place, though, is where they're found. Every one of these variants comes from a chalice dungeon. The base game weapons can be found in sarcophagi and other treasure chests, while the DLC ones must be purchased from a messenger shop in one of the lower level chalices, as you saw me doing earlier. Since these dungeons are actually the remains of pre-existing civilizations below Yharnam, the fact that they contain weapons nearly identical to those being made in our player character's time is meant to imply that these are independent discoveries being developed and then lost across time. This in turn suggests that we're dealing with repeating cycles of civilizations rising and falling. But as easy as it is to imagine that with a weapon like the Saw Cleaver, it's a little bit harder to picture if every version of Ludwig's Holy Blade still has Ludwig in its name, since he's specific to Bloodborne's modern historic timeline. Well, in Japanese, this isn't an issue outside of the identical descriptions, because the name Ludwig is removed from both weapon variants. Literally translated, these would be called the Odd-Natured Holy Blade and the Lost Holy Blade, respectively. Indeed, every Japanese weapon that has a proper noun in its name is treated this way. To be fair to the translators, though, I suspect that the reason the English doesn't uniformly follow the same convention is due to a last-minute update that only the Japanese text received. I say that because there are 2 English weapons that have proper nouns in their names that don't include them on their variants. Those would be Simon's Bowblade and the Cause Parasite, which are both DLC weapons that we've yet to acquire. Basically, I don't think it's a coincidence that the 2 English-language weapon names that do follow this Japanese naming convention are also the only 2 weapons with proper nouns in the latest addition to the game. Instead, I suspect that once the translators had a chance to follow the same pattern as the Japanese, they did, and that simply coincided with the translation of new material for the DLC. This would also explain another discrepancy between the English and Japanese names for the variant versions of the Chikage. Longtime viewers may recall that back in Translationborne 51, I brought up how the kanji used in the Chikage's name are not those for blood shadows, as might be expected of a sword that transforms by coating the blade in the blood of its wielder. Instead, the characters used are those for the number 1000 and the word seen or view, so it might be poetically rendered the Sword of 1,000 Vistas, in reference to how it arrived in Canehurst from a faraway land. That makes this another name you might not expect to see on the variant versions of the weapon, which could have been made and used in the same location, and so not have been renamed to reflect a foreign origin. Well, once again, the Japanese naming scheme accounts for this logic, because rather than refer to the lost and uncanny versions of the Chikage, the Japanese switches the 2 kanji involved to one that means blood and another that means sword. It's a small detail to go out on, but one that I really appreciate in the Japanese. And if my suspicions about the reasons for the discrepancy are correct, I only wish the translation team had the opportunity to come up with a suitable alternative to convey the idea of the name change in English. But once again, I've gone over time, so let me end the episode by reminding you to expect the Translationborne index linked in the description to be updated within 24 hours. Also, if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions for me, particularly if you want me to go over the Beast Cutter itself in more detail, please let me know. Until next time then, thanks for watching everyone.